Welcome to Global Watch with me, Charles Ubuni, today from the headquarters of the National Communications Council of Cameroon here in Yaoundé, Cameroon. 1,121 journalists have been killed since 1992, including 21 this year. 221 journalists were jailed last year, and 456 have been exiled since 2008. That is according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, one of the most important advocacy groups in the world, advancing the idea of a free press. And the brutal murder of journalists this year in Syria and Iraq only exposes the fact that journalists across the world are increasingly living in a hostile world. Hostility increased by the fact that media regulators across the world are clamming on journalists to be more responsible and restrictive in the practice of their profession. Today is World Press Freedom Day 2015. So who should take responsibility of what happens to journalists across the world? The media or the society? My guest today is an ex-journalist, an ex-one, who confesses to be practicing the profession still and happens to be the English voice behind President Paul Biya's addresses to the nation. Cameroonian Media Regulator Chief Peter Esoka, welcome to Global Watch.
Thank you, Charles. It's my pleasure to be here. Usually when I see people on the program, I say, wow, this fellow is in a hot seat. Now, I have accepted to be here, and I'm ready for the fire to burn.
January 7, 2015, French satirical journal Charlie Hebdo is stormed by armed men, killing some journalists. And months after, French media empire THEYWANT is hacked and shut down by activists claiming to belong to a terrorist organization called the Islamic State. This is freedom of information sacrificed on the altar of religion, because the article of Charlie Hebdo was simply called by some as provocative on religious ground.
Provocative? Maybe. But then when a journalist goes out for information, I think there is a question of responsibility, and also the fact that you have to look at the circumstances under which you are telling a story. Probably you have been threatened before, and now you have to be careful. And when you go beyond bounds, you expect that there will be some reprisals somewhere along the line. Charlie Hebdo, I would think, to a certain degree, they did their job. The press is supposed to be free. The press is supposed to go anywhere it wants to go. After all, principles of the United Nations allow for that. And I think every constitution in this world talks about the freedom of the press, freedom of speech. But the question is, are there limitations to freedom?
Mr. Esoka, you are talking of limitations. Should journalists of Charlie Hebdo be blamed, or the blame should be on society?
I think it will be on both society and the journalists.
Because the journalists of Charlie Hebdo would simply tell you that they were doing their job because the French legal system punishes anti-Semitism. But the French legal system does not punish blasphemy. And the Muslim community, some, consider that as a breach of their tradition. should the anger of those who attacked Charlie Hebdo may have been directed to the French authorities rather than Charlie Hebdo for having an unbalanced legal framework?
Maybe on the French government, maybe also on Charlie Hebdo, the responsibility of you, the journalists. When you notice, that's why we have to be very careful with the word freedom. When you notice that a certain area, it's itchy, be careful when you get there, because you could be scratched. And when you're scratched, that becomes dangerous for you. We have to weigh circumstances under which we go out there to propagate any kind of information. Legality is one thing, and the ability to make choices is another. It's not the first time Charlie Hebdo was threatened by the anti-Semicists. In so doing, Charlie Hebdo ought to be careful when you are treating or dealing with a certain set of people.
Sure. This is what is considered universally as the most accepted definition of freedom of the press: the right by newspapers, magazines, and other printed material to publish without governmental restriction and subject only to the laws of libel, obscenity, and sedition. Do you think that what happened in that case, what happened with the case of the American journalists who were gruesomely killed in Iraq and Syria in the beginning of the year, do you think that they breached what is found in this definition?
No, they didn't breach. I tell you that under certain circumstances, certain people do exaggerate, their motives for doing certain things. After all, we know what is happening in the Arab world, and how, especially when the Western media is concerned, they show a lot of animosity. And the moment you go beyond a certain level, especially in your reporting, they're on bunkers. And I say they do outrageous things. And so that's why I was talking about being careful. When an American journalist or a Cameroonian journalist or whoever who is practicing in the profession goes out there and doesn't have self-control, because there's also the essence of self-control. Yeah, some people call it self-censorship and all such things. I think as a journalist, I am cautious of the area in which I do a number of things. I weigh the kind of information I give out to the people. If it is insulting, if it is injurious, I think I will have to weigh my words and use the kind of language that will not imply.
Because insults are not accepted in the democratic society.
Absolutely not. They're not. And I think insult is condemned by the law. Consequently, if it happens, the law has its right to lay its arm.
We are talking about a liberal profession which is practiced worldwide, and for some years now you have been involved in regulating the media in Cameroon in particular. Before getting what you will not do as a journalist today, if you happen to be a journalist today, just tell me first of all, what have you noticed that you condemn journalists or blame them for doing which you consider is wrong? What have you...
I appreciate whatever the journalists are doing in their mark of freedom.
But certainly you have noticed certain elements which are probably out of the legal framework.
Charles, let me continue, all right? As I said, I do appreciate the freedom of the journalist to do what he wants to do. But I impose certain limitations on that journalist when he or she goes beyond certain basic ideological, basic ethical things. Because when you get out of the ethics, when you injure Charles Ebony, when you insult him in your newspaper or article or whatever, I think some people will say, well, let it be the place of Charles Ebony to take you to court because the penal code allows for such to happen.
What do you consider an insult?
When libel is. An insult is when you get into the dignity of a person, when you abuse that dignity, when you don't consider him as a person who has feelings. I try as much as possible to ask whoever does that to take himself and put in the place of that other person. If someone were to say the same things of you as you have said of somebody else, what would be your reaction? What would be society's reaction? A group of publishers came to the council once after we meted out a few sanctions on some professionals. And let me tell you that sanctions in this place are a last resort. Our basic principle is not to sanction people. It is more pedagogy rather than sanctioning or punishment. Now, they came. And when they had told their story, the question I asked one of them, and a very senior journalist, Mr. Junke, of the Nouvelle Expression, and of, what's the other one, his channel, his television, Equinox. I asked him, I said, sir, the journalist that you are, if Peter Esoka were to write something about you, he would appraise your performance. He would talk about what you have achieved in the profession, to the extent that you have left from just ordinary writing to creating even a television channel. And that's praiseworthy. But if I should take away all of that credit from you and talk of Severin Junke, this person who cannot even walk well, and you start touching on a man's life, that precious element of his, I think something is wrong somewhere, and that has to be checked. He agreed with me. And the protests came. They said, well, Grand Frère, we are happy that you could give us this lesson.
You just accepted that journalists have the entire freedom to write whatsoever they want to write. But
go ahead.
Yeah, but you know that at times when journalists write, the hands of the law is very hard on them, on the same crimes that other people commit freely. I give you a categorical example. In this nation, there was a minister who came on the air and said one journalist died of HIV and AIDS against the ethics of the medical profession, because you cannot declare the cause of the death of somebody without the family's approval that this person died of this disease. And he went unpunished. But when a journalist writes an article about, let's say, the health of the President of the Republic, he's simply hammered by the law. Why all these bias against journalists?
The law has not yet hammered on those who wrote about the health of the President. I was on a program, I think, on one of our friendly channels, and they asked me a similar question, and especially about my own health. And they asked whether they are wrong to tell people of my ill health. I told them why. I told them I was not feeling well. Consequently, they had a right to say it, that I was not feeling well. But when, for instance, the journalist you're referring to take an article that has been published by some other newspaper, a foreign newspaper, and they take it verbatim and put it for their public. Since when did President Paul Biya tell them he was sick. Did they investigate to find out whether President Paul Biya was sick?
There is a public figure, and a public figure does not have a private life. And one of the fundamental elements the Cameroonian public should have is that of knowing the health of their president, because as president, they own him. He does not own them because they brought him to power.
Find out when that information has not come out. Do you speculate? Because speculation only puts you in difficulty. Because suppose it comes out that it is not true. You've published that, oh, the President of the Republic is sick and dying because it was a question of a critical situation. Did you verify? There was a time there was an accident in Abomba, and some newspapers came out and said 6 died, 10 died. They didn't go to the field to find out whether indeed 10 or 6 people died, and they published it. When CRTV published or broadcast that there were 4 dead, everybody said, oh, CRTV is telling lies. But after investigation, they found out that 4 people died. People talk of lots of things without verifying. There is so much hearsay, and that's what we don't like. Because you have freedom doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say whatever you want to say. There's controlled freedom. Please. You don't just throw the things to the dogs. No, absolutely not.
Peter Esoka, you used to be a journalist. If you
I am a journalist. I've not stopped being a journalist.
But today you are a regulator, absolutely.
I am a regulator who is officially, that's my profession.
Okay.
I die a journalist.
Okay.
The regulator business, I can be sacked from there anytime, but I still remain a journalist.
Okay, let's imagine that you in reality, that you are practicing journalism today. What are those subjects? What are those subjects that you may not likely treat?
I would like to treat every subject, but with caution. I will have to investigate and find out whether what I am going to dish out to my public is true or false, or just tentative information. I would like to make sure that my audience or my readers get the rightful information rather than guessing what it's supposed to be or speculating on it. Mr. Ibune, I think to be a responsible journalist is for you to know the facts. And what is journalism? What is information? The facts, honesty, truthfulness. You don't go beating about the bush and coming out with an article that has no meaning because you want to have a stop press attitude. No, come on.
Maybe controlling or investigating or checking or, if you like, cancelling the newspapers, the radio, and television is easy. Just how successful are you regulators in controlling the internet? The Turkish method, just closing down YouTube, Facebook, Google, and Yahoo?
We still give them their liberty. And as we said, this regulatory body is pedagogic. It is only on extreme cases on which we are trying to fight. It may be very difficult. It's a very, very arduous task to try to control those online things that people post every day and say sometimes rubbish, I would say. They go beyond themselves to write out things that don't have any basis. But it's difficult for us to put a grip on some of them. However, this is a young house, I would say. The element of regulation is 2 years old, and we're still building up to lots of things. And during this period, we've been inviting some of the let me say, cable distributors. We've invited the people who are dealing with the cyber press. We've invited people who are dealing with ordinary press, and we've talked about them on this same table on what we should do as a group to make our profession a better one.
Sure, yes. A profession, a better one. One of you just heard me giving very terrible statistics about the fate of journalists across the world. Will you advise journalists to practice activism across the world?
Why should we practice activism? We are sane people. I'd like to believe.
So, if you say that journalists are not authorized to practice activism, that is a question
of authorized to. Let us be careful about the words we use.
Okay.
Authorized to. Who authorizes them?
Maybe by their conscience.
Well, now you get back to what I was saying. Use your conscience to do what.
So let's go by the profession. Activism is not accepted in journalism.
It shouldn't be.
So do you condemn those journalists who organized a support march against terrorism, against Boko Haram, because what they were doing, that was simply activism? Will you condemn that they were out of the track?
I don't know whether it could be a political ploy, because some journalists could also be used by politicians. They could be used. Did it come from out of their own conscience that they should do that? Why? Is it necessary?
Can you be categorical in saying whether you condemn or you don't condemn them?
And I'm trying to develop an issue. You asked a question. And I'm trying to develop it because at the end of the day, condemnation is not of me, but I can make proposals and I can suggest things and I tell them, don't get involved if I want to. Because what you portray is a different picture. Leave the politicians to do that. Let the other members of the civil society do some of those things. When we get into it, we're almost sellouts. I remember once I was called up to be a very important person in one of our political parties. I told them, immediately I become what you want me to become, I'll lose my objectivity. I'll no longer perform like the journalist you all know me to be, an objective journalist. So there are times when a journalist can stand up on his feet and say no to certain things. I don't get involved. And you continue to write your reports, even if it is about Boko Haram or whatever it is. That there you will be the professional. You will not be the activist, a political activist. Because all the moves that have been made are politically inclined. And I don't think that's our place as professionals.
Freedom of the press inevitably helps drive scientific progress, which in turn propels innovation and economic prosperity. How do you interpret the massive media restrictions and even the prevention of journalists in covering demonstrations?
What kind of demonstrations?
Last March 28, that the United Nations Security Council, Human Rights Council, is concerned by what is happening across the world, in Syria, in countries with totalitarian regimes, and that governments across the world, when they do that, they give the notion of national security.
Is a journalist an outlaw? A journalist is also supposed to respect the laws of the land. If you get somewhere and you want to do something, and the law of the land or the authorities of that land say no to it, I don't think you should have to force it. I know that there is no true democracy without a free press. The press is the watchdog of society. We all know that basic definition of who the journalist or the press is. The journalist, the watchdog of society. And so we let him do the watchdog job. But sometimes those dogs are toothless. They may bark and may not be able to achieve much, and they bark for nothing. I remember Robert Mugabe at one point when Zimbabwe and so forth, all of those, Rhodesia at the time, were struggling for their independence. They said the British government behaves like a toothless bulldog.
That barks without biting.
Wagging its tail in front of Ian Smith. You know, which says that, well, they were criticizing, or he was criticizing the British government. And sometimes, what do some of our journalists do? They bark and try to create an impression. But then at the end of the day, you don't see value. We have to be valuable, Mr. Ebune.
Constructive journalism.
Yes, it has to be constructive. Nobody says you should not criticize. Do it, but constructively. You don't just come because you're criticizing somebody for criticizing's sake. Esoka has a big head. Esoka is useless. Esoka has not even gone to school because, of course, newspaper articles came out that I am a simple radio animator whom Paul Biya has appointed to head. Are you happy? No, tell me. Are you happy to see the kind of journalism we practice? Many of you have
Peter Esoka, I'm afraid we have to end here.
Many of you have been to school. I know you pride yourself of the Boya University as having been one of the best of the journalism, whatever. And some of you are writing such rubbish in newspapers. And you expect me to sit down as a regulator and I'll let you do that? No, not because I am against journalists, but we want to straighten things. When there is order within our profession, I think order will return to society because they will respect us.
The acting chairman of the National Communication Council of Cameroon, Peter Esoka, thanks very much for accepting our invitation on Globe Watch.
Thank you, Charles. It was wonderful. I knew I was going to be on a seat, but I don't know how hot it was.